Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here again and to see you all being ready to talk about policy in the early morning, which is not necessarily the most interesting topic for anyone, but I quite like it, and I think, and I hope at least, you'll find some of the findings of this paper interesting. So today, first of all, my name is Axel Thévenet. I'm a policy advisor at Open Forum Europe. It's a Brussels-based think tank. But today I'm not holding that hat. I'm actually here to represent the, to represent the Open Source Observatory from the European Commission, or OSOR. And to start with that, because just so that you have some ideas of what OSOR is, OSOR has been existing for 15 years. It's a project from the European Commission that is basically looking at the use of open source in the public sector. On the platform, you can find many stuff, mostly news articles. So my team and I are writing news articles every month. We also have a newsletter. And we try to report about the most interesting cases of the use of open source in the public sector across the EU, also sometimes outside of the EU. We also organize some events, webinar, workshop that you can join if you're interested. Drop us a mail. We're always interested to have some new people joining us and to be able to discuss these subjects further. We also have a knowledge center, and maybe that's something that can also be interesting in the sense of we publish reports, guidelines, studies, also case studies on what we believe are the most interesting, the most informative examples of what is happening across the EU. And today I'm going to present one of our latest milestones, which is this paper on policy and trends. So it's an analysis that is trying to get an idea of what has happened in the EU over the last 10, 15 years, let's say, in terms of open source policy. But we also have some training courses coming up. We have a handbook that we've been working on. It's trying to help and support the use of open source in public administration by providing some form of guidelines, some form of guidance. As you can imagine, it's not easy doing open source in the public sector. I'm pretty sure a lot of you know about this. But yeah, so why do we talk about open source policy, and why do I believe this paper is important? It's pretty simple. There's obviously an increase in adoption of open source at the moment in the public sector in Europe, and trying to understand why is that and how is that happening can also give us some key insight in how to make it work forward and how to help support and increase this adoption of open source. And so for this, the paper is looking at two things. It's looking first at the key drivers for open source adoption. When I talk about key drivers, I talk about political motives. I talk about what politicians are talking about when they want to adopt open source. And so you probably have some ideas of what this can look like in your country, here in Germany or elsewhere. But what we were interested about is how did this evolve? Why are we talking about certain notions instead of others? And the second point that we looked at were the implementation strategies. So while there's key drivers and these motives that are being used, there's also different strategies being used at different levels of governance. If you look at a national government or at a local government, you obviously have very big differences in capacity, but also in the way it is being justified and the way it is being implemented. And so for this, we had quite a long process. I didn't start this process. I'm just doing the follow-up, actually. But it started in 2019, where a first team started producing country reports. These reports are basically trying to figure out, in a country, who is the main governmental actor responsible for the adoption of open source-related policy, then maybe who is the digital agency that is in charge of implementing that policy, as well as who are the main stakeholders in open source in that country. It also looks at the legal framework and at the main open source initiatives in that country. So the biggest project, the one that are bringing the most change in the way that the administration is working around. And so there was first a first round of country reports. Later on, we also had a first paper that was quantitative analysis of this whole report, trying to figure out some trends thanks to the research. And we then did a second round of reports and updates in 2023. That's the one I mostly wrote. With this paper, which is now a qualitative analysis based on more than 40 reports by now. It's covering all of the EU and also some other countries across the globe. On the second round, for example, we wrote about China, Japan, Singapore, Bolivia, Nigeria. And still today, we are working on updating all the European country reports to get a more recent idea of what's happening, with the goal of basically having, at the end of this period, around 25, 26, a last paper that will combine these two methods and also try to bring new insights based on this and a more actual one. But so this paper itself is trying to get an idea of all this evolution, right? It's mostly focused on this 16 new report that we wrote in 2022, 2023. And it's going in basically two parts: motives and implementation strategies. So to start very quickly with the key drivers, we identified three main ones. First, digital sovereignty, then transparency, and then crisis response and efficiency. You're probably not, it's not the first time that you hear about those, right? Especially digital sovereignty. I think it's by now the main key driver for open source adoption across the bloc, especially in regards to the recent events in the world. We obviously see a higher and higher increase in this notion being pushed on the political discourse. But when we talked about digital sovereignty, what we actually realized is that it didn't start just now, it didn't start just at this concept that's being pushed right now since 5 years, more or less. It first started with data privacy concerns. And there, this whole notion of digital sovereignty was more related to the control of citizen data. I'm not going to teach Germans about data protection. You have way better case law than half of the world about this. But basically, we had very strong example, for example, in Sweden, where we had the ESAM, or e-delegation back then, that then became the ESAM. That was one of the first governmental-related initiatives that started having strong concerns, and to voice these concerns in a paper, and we're basically talking about the fact that because of the American legislation, they had to protect their citizens and to potentially change their infrastructure and change the way they were operating. So they issued recommendations and so on. And these data privacy concerns, you can find them across the bloc, right? There's other countries that had them. This happened more or less before 2010, around 2008. But slowly, you had more and more countries pushing for this idea of digital sovereignty, and it's not new at all. One of the oldest places where we saw the mention of digital sovereignty was actually Bolivia in 2011, which was already pushing a law for the adoption of open source back then to also become independent from the US. You can imagine why. And nowadays, the EU bloc has started to push this notion. France and Germany are some of the biggest proponents of it. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to explain better than the people that were here yesterday and that are here today about the German organization that are doing this, but we now have in Germany a Center for Digital Sovereignty and a sovereign tech agency. So the notion of it itself has been a key driver. But it's also present in France, for example. There were many discussions from 2014 to now, basically, where the notion of digital sovereignty was discussed in Parliament. It was also discussed in a directive from the French government, and it helped drive the adoption of some open source solutions at governmental level. When it comes to transparency, it's a bit different, but while the countries I've mentioned before can be also interested about this, or were also interested about this, one of the main proponents of it was actually the Netherlands. And the Netherlands have had a very strong transparency policy. We have now something called the Open Unless policy in the Netherlands. And there's also the Open Government Act from 2022. Both of these legislations, which are directly trying to create a more transparent government, have helped push for open source adoption, either through the disclosure of source code or just through the change in terms of development strategies. The Netherlands is quite mature as well in terms of the way they use open source in public administrations. There's a lot of stakeholders involved in this. And so we've seen through this idea of transparency quite an increase. And the last key driver that was identified is crisis response. Obviously, COVID-19 and the invasion of Ukraine have been two gigantic crises that have destabilized our infrastructures, and there was a need for a very strong response and a very quick and efficient one. And that's where a lot of open source solutions came in very quickly to be able to respond and to support whatever was needed then. When it comes to the COVID-19, again with the Netherlands, we had, for example, the Corona Melder app that was developed in collaboration with many different professionals from different fields, but that was an open source app and that helped basically create a quick response and a quick solution to support the government in its delivery of public services. When it comes to the invasion of Ukraine, we saw a lot of associations, but also neighboring countries, either single developers, but also more organized associations that were able to develop solutions to help refugees, but also just give the right informations when there was nothing else. And if you look at how the Ukrainian government is doing today in terms of digitalization, they're also very strong in terms of open source. Their main digital project, the DIA, the digital identity application, is fully open source, and it's quite an example of how to do open source in public government. Looking very quickly now then therefore at implementation strategies, we have basically very different strategies at national level. What we witnessed was an evolution from mandatory use to collaborative approaches. What that means is at the beginning of 2010s, we had a lot of forced use of open source that wasn't really effective. We had this in Bulgaria, Italy, and Greece, and we are now seeing way more collaborative approaches with the ecosystem, where there's a lot more collaboration happening. We also have a bottom-up collaboration. Here, we're talking about association being used by governments and being talked with by governments to make sure that there's efficient use of open source, but also basically collaboration with the stakeholders of that country. There's also a development of open source program offices. The OSPOs is a structure that's been getting traction over the last years, and that is helping basically structure the use of open source in the government. It's quite useful. It's also bringing some resilience to the structures. We'll soon have a study about OSPOs being published on OSOR. And finally, and here in Germany, there's a very good example of this. It's a focus on digital infrastructure security. So the Sovereign Tech Fund, now Sovereign Tech Agency, was one of the first initiative of that sort. But there has been similar initiative at European level. We had FOSSA and FOSSEPs, which were already looking at critical infrastructure and how to maintain and support them. Then when we look at the cities and regional level, so at a local level, there's a strong, very strong level of implementation through collective IT development and the resource pooling. A very good example of this in Germany is the KGST in Nordrhein-Westfalen. They have been very supportive with their members, with the city members, to push for more open source. And they've been basically supporting their use and making sure they had the right information, the right guidelines, and so on. And they're still doing it. They've published a very good report not so long ago. There's also quite a lot of reuse of field-specific solutions. I'm thinking, for example, about participatory democratic application like Decidim, but also now with the passing of this new act at European level called the Interoperable Europe Act, there will be probably more sharing and reuse of these solutions across the EU. And finally, we see also at local level a lot of association working with cities and regions to help implement projects, showing the great need to basically work with the people that are there, on the ground, on the field. Finally, the last level of governance we looked at were the European international initiatives. We had yesterday a great panel about the UN Sustainable Development Goals and also all the UN initiatives, so I'm not going to dive too deep into this, but the UN has been a big driver in adoption of open source across the globe, trying to push for common solutions to be reused and to push this concept of SDGs. There's also the Digital Public Good Alliance, also UN-related initiative that has been also supporting that effort. At the same time, we also have the concept of digital commons. Here again, this is also gaining more and more traction, and it's one of the way that we saw open source being implemented at an international level. Right now, there's a project of cross-country infrastructure, or European Digital Infrastructure Consortium, an EDIC, as we say in Brussels, about digital commons, implicating France, Germany, Estonia, and the Netherlands. And this could be also quite one of the key implementation strategies at European level for open source. And finally, and not the least, there's been a lot of global solutions, global open source communities that have been helping to drive implementation. So here it's, for example, the OSGeo community, where the need for mapping in different countries has driven a lot of international collaboration. And so just to conclude on all of this, what I think is important to remember is we shifted in the last 15 years from mandatory approaches to comprehensive ecosystem approaches. That's one of the key messages here, because governments started to realize the importance of working with the open source community, and they need to be encouraged to do it more, but they're seeing better results doing so. And so there's way stronger collaboration with every stakeholders, either public or private or associative, but also with the different level of governance in a country where national governments now work a bit more with also regional level and international. And while there's a lot of talks about sovereignty at the moment, we did witness quite a balance between sovereignty, transparency, but also other different key drivers for adoption of open source across the bloc. So the focus on sovereignty only should not hide what's been done before and what will probably be done after. But yeah, so that's more or less most of what I had to explain about this paper. If you're interested, you can find it on OSOR. And if you have any questions, feel free to address them at our email address. I guess we still have some time for question. Okay, amazing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the talk, and thank you for being so on time. We have a ton of time for questions, everybody. And I see one hand over here, so I'm going to head over to you first.
Thank you for presenting and for laying out these 3 key drivers for open source adoption. I was particularly pleased to see that cost saving is not one of them, as it used to be many years ago. And my question is, out of the 3 you identified, which is going to be the one that actually turns out to be something where hopes and expectations and promises kept are in alignment?
That's a very good question. Thank you for this. First of all, on cost efficiency, absolutely. We did see it, right, in the way it was talked about. But we also choose to look at the political values that are being put on open source, which is the one that will hold up. I will maybe answer a bit differently to say that right now the main driver for adoption of open source is sovereignty. The main talks in Brussels, but also across member states, is sovereignty. That's what everyone is talking about. There's huge discussions, for example, right now about this thing called the Eurostack, where policymakers, but also economists or technologists are trying to push for the creation of a European stack of technology, which would obviously include open source. Not only that, but yes. And when looking at digital sovereignty, I'm quite aware, or I'm trying to stay quite aware of the potential pitfalls of it. Because while sovereignty as a concept is very important and we absolutely need it at EU level, it cannot exist in a vacuum. Sovereignty doesn't exist in a vacuum, and sovereignty only exists in comparison to other people's sovereignty. And so maybe one of the key realizations of the next years will be to understand how to have a sovereign infrastructure that is also interconnected to the rest of the world, where standardization between those different infrastructures will be harmonized to a level where we can still have global free trade and all of the current system advantages that we have. So I think, to me, that's the main interrogation, at least, about this. For sure, otherwise, open source will keep being one of the most one of the best tools for transparency. That's, I think, the one value where we are sure to see effects being created by the implementation of open source.
So I'm not sure if this was also part of your research, but it's a hot topic, so I assume yes. So if you could say a little bit more about the sustainable consumption of open source, because I think that for the sovereignty to work and all the other drivers to work in the long run, it has to be sustainable. So we have here in Germany, like we've heard about the Sovereign Tech Agency, which used to be the Sovereign Tech Fund. So there are plans for funding open source to securing the digital infrastructure. How do you see that beyond Germany, like across Europe maybe? Is it something you can comment on?
Absolutely. I think when I talked about this evolution, right, from mandatory use of open source to more understanding and comprehensive policies, that's something we didn't see only from Germany. We saw it in France, as for example, where there's been a greater involvement of stakeholders. And when we talk about this involvement of stakeholders, what we also mean is basically making sure we make good use of the technical skills of the private sector, right? And to support this project. At the moment at EU level, there's no significant project of the same level as the Sovereign Tech Agency. There are discussions about maybe how to do this that are going around, but there's nothing clear, and there's not enough political will nor clear decisions taken anywhere, that's for sure. But there are different governments that are still financing open source projects, not necessarily with the same intent, and that's maybe the difference, and that's also why when we saw the Sovereign Tech Fund being created and then being transformed into what it is today, it was so important and so impressive to see, because the intent with which the work is being done in this agency is quite a unique thing so far in Europe. There's very little comparable projects. There's still a lot of municipalities, a lot of associations, a lot of local governments funding and giving back to the open source ecosystem, either by having in-house developers also supporting projects, or just by funding it through public procurement or other projects. But there's no big strategies, let's say.
Thanks for that interesting talk. I'm curious about the methodology you used to gather all of the data. So it sounds like you did a huge amount of work across a lot of different countries. Mm-hmm. What was the approach? Was it easy to get the data? Was it hidden? Did you have to sue?
It was really difficult when I did the report on China. Obviously, I don't speak Chinese, sadly. Generally speaking, it was more or less easy when we talked about EU countries, because we already had some contacts, right? And we could always contact administrations and the governments of these countries to talk with them. But in a lot of countries, there's no dedicated person that is working on open source. There's not one person that can answer this. So we had to find a way around, talk to open source association. We had some very, very great people, and I'm very thankful to them. I don't know if there's some of them in the room, actually, I think, that helped us shaping this report. There's obviously mistakes in those, right? It's not exhaustive. It's not showing everything that is happening in the country. If you know of anything else, send us a mail. Like, we're very happy to talk about anything you've known of that we haven't. But yeah, basically we've led interviews with stakeholders, either public, private. We did a lot of legal research through, because now most countries have their laws online. And we always try to basically show the report to the main agency for digitalization in that country, to have them check it, see if there's anything missing, see if there's anything wrong. And so you will see in a lot of reports that there was a kind contribution of someone. That means they've actually checked what we did. And they have looked at if we did a mistake. And the one problem with that is just we realized in most countries, there's not one person that knows everything, which is logical. Therefore, there was a big need of talking to a lot of people, and everyone had their own perspective. So it was a lot of aggregating all of this.
Thank you. Thank you. Really, really interesting paper and great talk. I'm interested in if there's like further work that goes into infrastructure, if you think about it, because there are many, many different kinds of infrastructure. And my question really has sort of two parts. Are there sort of groups beginning to focus on different parts of infrastructure, like water, energy, banking, healthcare, transport, because the solutions may look different? And then also, when you look inside those infrastructure silos, there's a intertwined connection between public and private operators in that space. So I'm just wondering if there's any work being done about thinking about that, how it works in implementation, because there's no, anyway, anything on breakdown in infrastructure, and how is that balance between public and private looking?
Thank you for the question. So that's actually, I wouldn't be able to give a very good answer on this, but I'm still going to try. There is some field-specific or infrastructure-specific work being done. I wouldn't say it's mostly by governments. What we saw is mainly, for example, open source foundations working on this. I would say, though, at European level, you do have project-specific law. For example, I'm thinking of digital identity, where you have, for example, a big work right now on harmonized digital identity over the whole EU member states. You do have, I guess, more related field-specific. I'm thinking also, for example, of RTE in France, which is electrical grid-related field, where they have a very strong involvement there, and they have field-specific solution, right? How much is that actually organized and separated and or done at EU level in the best way possible? I wouldn't be able to say, because I think it's a lot of, basically, it's a lot of people inside an industry working to try and push for open source inside of the industry, maybe managing to collaborate with other people in other countries in the same industry, but not necessarily having a managerial level or executive level authorization or support to do so. And we see, I think, not that many European consortium, for example, of, I don't know, electricity providers working together on those. There is some, but not clearly for every field. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much for the talk, Axel, and thank you for taking so many questions.